The 11 good to great CEOs are some of the most remarkable CEOs of the century. Given that only 11 companies from the Fortune 500 met the exacting standards for entry into this study. Yet, despite their remarkable results, almost no one ever remarked about them. George Cain, Alan Wurtzel, David Maxwell, Coleman Mockler, Darwin Smith, Jim Herring, Lyle Everingham, Joe Coleman, Fred Allen, Cork Walgreen, Carl Reichert. How many of these extraordinary executives have you heard of? When we systematically tabulated all 5,979 articles in the study, we found fewer articles surrounding the transition date for the good to great companies than for the comparisons, by a factor of 2. Furthermore, we rarely found articles that focused on the good to great CEOs. The good to great leaders never wanted to become larger-than-life heroes. They never aspired to be put on a pedestal or become unreachable icons. They were seemingly ordinary people quietly producing extraordinary results. Some of the comparison leaders provide a striking contrast. Scott Paper, the comparison company to Kimberly-Clark, hired a CEO named Al Dunlap, a man cut from very different cloth than Darwin Smith. Dunlap loudly beat on his own chest, telling anyone who would listen, and many who would prefer not to, about what he had accomplished. Quoted in Business Week about his 19 months atop Scott Paper, he boasted, quote, "The Scott story will go down in the annals of American business history as one of the most successful, quickest turnarounds ever, making other turnarounds pale by comparison," unquote. According to Business Week, Dunlap personally accrued $100 million for 603 days of work at Scott Paper. Do the math. That's $165,000 per day, largely by slashing the workforce, cutting the R&D budget in half, and putting the company on growth steroids in preparation for sale. After selling off the company and pocketing his quick millions, Dunlap wrote a book about himself, in which he trumpeted his nickname Rambo in Pinstripes. Quote, "I love the Rambo movies. Here's a guy who has zero chance of success and always wins. Rambo goes into situations against all odds expecting to get his brains blown out, but he doesn't. At the end of the day, he succeeds. He gets rid of the bad guys. He creates peace out of war. That's what I do too," unquote. Darwin Smith may have enjoyed the mindless Rambo movies as well, but I suspect he never walked out of a theater and said to his wife, "You know, I really relate to that Rambo character. He reminds me of me." Granted, the Scott Paper story is one of the more dramatic in our study, but it's not an isolated case. In over 2/3 of the comparison cases, we noted the presence of a gargantuan personal ego that contributed to the demise or continued mediocrity of the company. We found this pattern particularly strong in the unsustained comparisons. These are cases where the company would show a leap in performance under a talented yet egocentric leader, only to decline in later years. Lee Iacocca, for example, saved Chrysler from the brink of catastrophe, performing one of the most celebrated, and deservedly so, turnarounds in American business history. Chrysler rose to a height of 2.9 times the market at a point about halfway through Iacocca's tenure. Then, however, he diverted his attention to making himself one of the most celebrated CEOs in American business history. Investors Business Daily and the Wall Street Journal chronicled how Iacocca appeared regularly on talk shows like The Today Show and Larry King Live, personally starring in over 80 commercials, entertained the idea of running for President of the United States, quoted at one point, quote, "Running Chrysler has been a bigger job than running the country. I could handle the national economy in 6 months," unquote, and widely promoted his autobiography. The book, Iacocca, sold 7 million copies and elevated him to rock star status, leading him to be mobbed by thousands of cheering fans upon his arrival in Japan. Iacocca's personal stock soared, but in the second half of his tenure, Chrysler's stock fell 31% behind the general market. Sadly, Iacocca had trouble leaving center stage and letting go of the perks of executive kingship. He postponed his retirement so many times that insiders at Chrysler began to joke that Iacocca stood for "I am chairman of Chrysler Corporation always." And when he finally did retire, he demanded that the board continue to provide private jet and stock options. Later, he joined forces with noted takeover artist Kirk Kerkorian to launch a hostile takeover bid for Chrysler. Chrysler experienced a brief return to glory in the 5 years after Iacocca's retirement, but the company's underlying weaknesses eventually led to a buyout by German carmaker Daimler-Benz. Certainly, the demise of Chrysler as a standalone company does not rest entirely on Iacocca's shoulders. The next generation of management made the fateful decision to sell the company to the Germans. But the fact remains. Iacocca's brilliant turnaround in the early 1980s did not prove to be sustained, and Chrysler failed to become an enduring great company. It is very important to grasp that Level 5 leadership is not just about humility and modesty. It's equally about ferocious resolve and almost stoic determination to do whatever needs to be done to make the company great. Remember Darwin Smith, if you have a cancer in your arm, you have to have the guts to cut off your own arm. Indeed, we debated for a long time on the research team about how to describe the good to great leaders. Initially, we penciled in terms like selfless executive and servant leader. But members of the team objected to these characterizations. "Those labels just don't ring true," said Anthony Chiricos. "It makes them sound weak or meek, but that's not at all the way I think of Darwin Smith or Coleman Mockler. They would do almost anything to make the company great." Then Eve Lee on the team suggested, why don't we just call them Level 5 leaders? If we put a label like selfless or servant on them, people will get entirely the wrong idea. We need to get people to engage with the whole concept, to see both sides of the coin. If you only get the humility side, you miss the whole idea. Level 5 leaders are fanatically driven, infected with an incurable need to produce results. They will sell the mills or fire their brother if that's what it takes to make the company great. When George Kane became chief executive of Abbott Laboratories, it sat in the bottom quartile of the pharmaceutical industry, a drowsy enterprise that had lived for years off its cash cow, erythromycin. George Kane didn't have an inspiring personality to galvanize the company, but he had something much more powerful: inspired standards. He could not stand mediocrity in any form and was utterly intolerant of anyone who would accept the idea that good is good enough. Kane then set out to destroy one of the key causes of Abbott's mediocrity: nepotism. Systematically rebuilding both the board and the executive team with the best people he could find, Kane made it clear that neither family ties nor length of tenure would have anything to do with whether you held a key position in the company. If you didn't have the capacity to become the best executive in the industry in your span of responsibility, then you would lose your paycheck. Such rigorous rebuilding might be expected from an outsider brought in to turn the company around. But Kane, he was an 18-year veteran, insider, and a family member, the son of a previous Abbott president. I often wondered what holidays were like for George Kane. Sorry I had to fire you. You want another slice of turkey? In the end, though, family members were quite pleased with the performance of their stock. For Kane set in motion a profitable growth machine that, from its transition date in 1974 to 2000, created shareholder returns that beat the market 4.5 to 1, handily outperforming industry superstars Merck and Pfizer. Upjohn, the direct comparison company to Abbott, also had family leadership during the same era as George Kane. This shows the power of matched pairs. At that pivotal time in the early 1960s, Both companies were virtually identical. Similar products, family leadership, similar history, similar sales, and yet different outcomes in the end. See, unlike George Cain, Upjohn's chief executive never showed the same resolve to break the mediocrity of nepotism. By the time Abbott had filled all key seats with the best people, regardless of family background, Upjohn still had B-level family members holding key positions. Virtually identical companies with identical stock charts up to the point of transition, Upjohn then fell 89% behind Abbott over the next 21 years, and then capitulated in a merger to Pharmacia in 1995. As an interesting aside, Darwin Smith, Coleman Mockler, and George Cain came from inside the company. And notice this, Stanley Galt, Al Dunlop, and Lee Iacocca rode in as saviors from the outside, trumpets blaring. This reflects a more systematic finding from our study. The evidence does not support the idea that you need an outside leader to come in and shake the place up to go from good to great. In fact, going for a high-profile outside change agent is negatively correlated with a sustained transformation from good to great. 10 of 11 good to great CEOs came from inside the company, 3 of them by family inheritance. The comparison companies, the companies that failed to make a leap from good to great, or even if they did, they failed to sustain it, the mediocre contrasts in the study, they turned to outside saviors with 6 times greater frequency, and yet they failed to produce great results. A superb example of insider-driven change comes from Charles R. Cork Walgreen III, who transformed Dowdy Walgreens into a company that outperformed the stock market by over 15 times from the end of 1975 to January 1, 2000. After years of dialogue and debate with his executive team about Walgreens' food service operations, Cork sensed that the team had finally reached a watershed point of clarity and understanding. Walgreens' brightest future lay in convenient drugstores, not food service. Dan Jornt, who succeeded Walgreens as chief executive in 1998, described what happened next. Cork said at one of our planning meetings, "Okay, now I'm going to draw a line in the sand. We're going to be out of the restaurant business completely in 5 years." At the time, we had over 500 restaurants. You could have heard a pin drop. He said, "I want to let everybody know the clock is ticking." 6 months later, we were at our next planning committee meeting, and someone mentioned just in passing that we had 5 years to be out of the restaurant business. Cork was not a real vociferous fellow. He sort of tapped on the table and said, "Listen, you have 4.5 years. I said you had 5 years 6 months ago. Now you've got 4.5 years. Well, that next day, things really clicked into gear to winding down our restaurant business. He never wavered. He never doubted. He never second-guessed. Like Darwin Smith selling the mills, Walgreens' decision required stoic resolve. Not that food service was the largest part of the business, although it did add substantial profits to the bottom line. The real problem was more emotional. Walgreens had, after all, invented the malted milkshake, and food service was a long-standing family tradition, dating back to his grandfather. Some food service outlets even named after the CEO himself, a restaurant chain named Corky's. But no matter. If Walgreens had to fly in the face of long-standing family tradition in order to focus its resources where it could be the best in the world, that being the convenient drugstores, Cork would do it. Quietly, doggedly, simply. The quiet, dogged nature of Level 5 leaders showed up not only in big decisions like selling off the food service operations or fighting the corporate raiders at Gillette, but also in a personal style of sheer workmanlike diligence. Alan Wurtzel, a second-generation family member who took over his family's small company and turned it into Circuit City, perfectly captured the gestalt of this trait. When asked about differences between himself and his counterpart CEO at Circuit City's comparison company, Wurtzel summed up: the show horse and the plow horse. He was more of a show horse, whereas I was more of a plow horse. The window and the mirror. Alan Wurtzel's plow horse comment is fascinating in light of two other facts. First, he holds a Doctor of Jurisprudence from Yale. Clearly, his plow horse nature had nothing to do with a lack of intelligence. Second, his plow horse approach set the stage for truly best-in-show results. Let me put it this way. If you had to choose between $1 invested in Circuit City or $1 invested in General Electric on the day that legendary Jack Welch took over GE in 1981 and held it to January 1, 2000, you would have been better off with Circuit City, and not just by a little bit, by 6 times. Not a bad performance for a plow horse. You might expect that extraordinary results like these would lead Alan Wurtzel to discuss the brilliant decisions he made. But when we asked him to list the top 5 factors in his company's transformation ranked by importance, Wurtzel gave a surprising answer. The number 1 factor was luck. We were in a great industry, he said, with the wind at our backs. We pushed back, pointing out that we selected the good to great companies based on performance that surpassed their industry's average. Furthermore, the comparison company, Silo, was in the same industry with the same wind and probably bigger sales. We debated the point for a few minutes, with Wurtzel continuing his preference for attributing much of his success to just being in the right place at the right time. Later, when we asked to discuss the factors behind the enduring nature of the transformation, he said, well, the first thing that comes to mind is luck. I was lucky to find the right successor. Luck. What an odd factor to talk about. Yet the good to great executives talked a lot about luck. In one interview with a Nucor executive, we asked why the company had such a remarkable track record of good decisions. He responded, I guess we were just lucky. Joseph F. Coleman III, the Level 5 transition CEO of Philip Morris, flat out refused to take credit for his company's success, attributing his good fortune to having great colleagues, successors, and predecessors. Even the book he wrote, a book he undertook at the urging of his colleagues, which he never intended to distribute widely, had the unusual title, I'm a Lucky Guy. The opening paragraph reads, I was a very lucky guy from the beginning of my life. Marvelous parents, good genes, lucky in love, lucky in business, and lucky when a Yale classmate had my orders changed to report to Washington, D.C. in early 1941, instead of to a ship that was sunk with all hands lost in the North Atlantic. Lucky to be in the Navy, and lucky to be alive at 85. We were at first puzzled by this emphasis on good luck. After all, we found no evidence that the good to great companies were blessed with more good luck, or bad luck, for that matter, than the comparison companies. Then we began to notice a contrasting pattern in the mediocre comparison executives. They credited substantial blame to bad luck, frequently bemoaning the difficulties of the environment they faced. Compare Bethlehem Steel to Nucor. Both companies operated in the steel industry and produced hard-to-differentiate products. Both companies faced the competitive challenge of cheap imported steel. Yet executives at the two companies had completely different views of the same environment. Bethlehem's chief executive summed up the company's problems in 1983 by blaming imports. Quote, our first, second, and third problems are imports, unquote. Ken Iverson and his crew at Nucor considered the same challenge from imports as a blessing, a stroke of good fortune. Almost as if they're saying, aren't we lucky? Steel is heavy, and they have to ship it all the way across the ocean, giving us a huge advantage. Iverson saw the first, second, and third problems facing the American steel industry not to be imports, but American steel management. Iverson even went so far as to speak out publicly against government protection against imports, telling a stunned gathering of fellow steel executives in 1977 that the real problems facing the American steel industry lay in the fact that management had failed to keep pace with innovation. The emphasis on luck turns out to be part of a pattern that we came to call the window and the mirror. Level 5 leaders look out the window to apportion credit to factors outside themselves when things go well. And if they cannot find a specific person or event to give credit to, they credit good luck. At the same time, they look in the mirror to apportion responsibility, never blaming bad luck when things go poorly. The comparison leaders often did just the opposite. They'd look out the window for something or someone outside themselves to blame for poor results, but would preen in front of the mirror and credit themselves when things went well. Strangely, the window and the mirror do not reflect objective reality. Everyone outside the window points inside directly at the level 5 leader, saying, "He was the key. Without his guidance and leadership, we would not have become a great company." And the level 5 leader points right back out the window and says, "Look at all the great people and good fortune that made this possible. I'm a lucky guy." They're both right, of course, but the level 5s would never admit that fact. So let me just do a quick summary of the two sides of level 5 leadership. Again, a level 5 leader is one who is ambitious first and foremost for the cause, the company, the work, not himself or herself. And on the other hand, has the stoic resolve, the will to do whatever it takes to make good on that ambition. So you've got professional will and personal humility, two sides of a coin. Now, let me just go through those two sides and talk about them very briefly. On the one hand, professional will. A level 5 leader creates superb results, a clear catalyst in the transition from good to great. And yet, on the other hand, personal humility. The level 5 leader demonstrates a compelling modesty, shunning public adulation. A level 5 leader is never boastful. On the one hand, professional will. A level 5 leader demonstrates an unwavering resolve to do whatever must be done to produce the best long-term results, no matter how difficult, no matter how painful. And yet, on the other hand, professional humility. A level 5 leader acts with quiet, calm determination. A level 5 leader relies principally on inspired standards, not inspiring charisma to motivate. On the one hand, professional will. A level 5 leader sets the standards for building an enduring great company, will settle for nothing less than greatness. And yet, on the other hand, personal humility. A level 5 leader channels ambition into the company, not the self. A level 5 leader sets up successors for even greater success in the next generation. On the one hand, professional will. A level 5 leader looks in the mirror, not out the window, to apportion responsibility for poor results, never blaming other people, external factors, or bad luck. When things go awry, a level 5 leader looks in the mirror and says, "I am responsible." And yet, on the other hand, personal humility. A level 5 leader looks out the window, not in the mirror, to apportion credit for the success of the company, pointing to other people, to other factors, and to good luck. Cultivating level 5 leadership. While I was writing this book, I shared the level 5 finding with a gathering of senior executives. A woman who had recently become chief executive of her company raised her hand and said, "I believe what you say about the good to great leaders, but I'm disturbed because when I look in the mirror, I know I'm not level 5. Not yet anyway. I don't see a level 5 staring back. Are you telling me that I can't make this a great company if I'm not level 5? I don't know for certain that you absolutely must be a level 5 leader to make your company great," I replied. I will simply point back to the data. Of 1,435 companies that appeared on the Fortune 500 in our initial candidate list, only 11 companies made the very tough cut into our study. In those 11, all of them had level 5 leadership in key positions, including the chief executive at the pivotal time of transition. She sat there, quiet for a moment, and you could tell everyone in the room was mentally urging her to ask the question. Finally, she said, "Can you learn to become level 5? At the time that I wrote this book, my hypothesis was that there are two categories of people: those who do not have the seat of level 5 and those who do. The first category consists of people who could never in a million years bring themselves to subjugate their egoistic needs to the greater ambition of building something larger and more lasting than themselves. For these people, work will always be first and foremost about what they get: fame, fortune, adulation, power, whatever. Not what they build, create, and contribute. The great irony is the animus and personal ambition that often drive people to positions of power stand at odds with the humility required for level 5 leadership. When you combine that irony with the fact that boards of directors frequently operate under the false belief that they need to hire larger-than-life, egocentric, charismatic leaders to make an organization great, you can quickly see why level 5 leaders rarely appear at the top of our institutions. The second category of people, and I suspect the larger group, consists of those who have the potential to evolve to level 5. The capability resides within them, perhaps buried or ignored, but there nonetheless. And under the right circumstances, self-reflection, conscious personal development, a mentor, a great teacher, loving parents, a significant transformational life experience, a level 5 boss, or any number of other factors, they begin to develop. And looking at the data, we noticed that some of the leaders in our study had significant life experiences that might have furthered their maturation. Darwin Smith fully blossomed after his experience with cancer. Joe Cullman was profoundly affected by his World War II experiences, particularly that last-minute change of orders that took him off a doomed ship on which he surely would have died. A strong religious belief or conversion might also nurture development of level 5 traits. Coleman Mockler, for example, converted to evangelical Christianity while getting his MBA at Harvard, and later, according to the book Cutting Edge, became a prime mover in a group of Boston business executives who met frequently over breakfast to discuss the carryover of religious values to corporate life. Other leaders in our study, however, had no obvious catalytic event. They just led normal lives and somehow ended up atop the level 5 hierarchy. I believe, although I cannot prove, that potential level 5 leaders are highly prevalent in our society. The problem is not, in my estimation, a dearth of potential level 5 leaders. They exist all around us if we just know what to look for. And what is that? Look for situations where extraordinary results exist, but where no individual steps forth to claim excess credit. You will likely find a potential level 5 leader at work. I'd love to be able to give you a list of steps for becoming level 5. I'd love to be able to give you the simple prescription. But we have no solid research data that would support such a simple prescription. Our research exposed level 5 as a key component inside the black box of what it takes to shift a company from good to great. Yet inside that black box is yet another black box, namely the inner development of a person to level 5. We could speculate on what might be inside that inner black box, but it would be mostly just that, speculation. So in short, level 5 is a very satisfying idea, a powerful idea, and to produce the best transitions from good to great, perhaps an essential idea. A 10-step list, a simple prescription, a simplistic answer would trivialize the concept. One thought is to begin practicing the other good to great disciplines we discovered. We found a symbiotic relationship between level 5 and the remaining chapters. On the one hand, level 5 traits enable you to implement the other findings. On the other hand, practicing the other findings helps you to become level 5. Think of it this way. This chapter is about what level 5s are. The rest of this book describes what they do. Leading with the other disciplines can help you move in the right direction. There is no guarantee that doing so will turn you into a full-fledged level 5, but it does give you a tangible place to begin. We cannot say for sure what percentage of people have the seed of level 5 within them, or how many of those can nurture it. Even those of us who discovered level 5 on the research team do not know for ourselves whether we will succeed in fully evolving to level 5. And yet, all of us who worked on the finding have been deeply affected and inspired by the idea. Darwin Smith, Coleman Mockler, Alan Wurtzel, and all the other level 5s we learned about have become models for us, something worthy to aspire toward. Whether or not we make it all the way to level 5, it's worth the effort. For like all basic truths about what is best in human beings, When we catch a glimpse of that truth, we know that our own lives and all that we touch will be better for the effort. The words you've just heard, I wrote in 2000 and 2001, summarizing the findings from Good to Great. In the intervening years, and now I'm re-recording the book in almost 2005. And in the intervening time, I've had a fascinating experience with Level 5, and I'd like to share it with you. See, when we finished those words, I have to admit I was a little bit depressed because I felt, my goodness, these Level 5s, they must be just freaks of nature. I mean, how many Level 5s can there be? Maybe we're all doomed. It seemed kind of dark to me. And then an astounding thing happened. I started to get emails and correspondence and people stopping me at seminars and talks and saying, you know, Jim, there was this person in my life that was just an amazing creator of results and a spectacular performance and a wonderful team. And I could never really put my finger on what to make of them because they didn't fit into any of the standard models of leadership that I'd read about. It could have been a platoon commander or a teacher or a high school sports coach or a division leader or a Girl Scout council leader. They came in all walks of life, but people would say there was this person, this amazing person in my life, but they just didn't fit the mold of a leader. And yet, there they were doing amazing things with a group of people. And then I read the Level 5 chapter, and bang, flash, I got it. Jim, that person was a Level 5, and now I understand. The Level 5 finding helps me understand the remarkable contributions of this person. And this has happened not tens of times, but thousands of times. And as I stand back and reflect upon it, the conclusion I've come to, and I find it an uplifting conclusion, an inspiring conclusion, there's Level 5 throughout society. I've come to the conclusion that Level 5 is the mortar that holds the bricks of society together. We do have Level 5 teachers, and we do have Level 5 police chiefs, and we do have Level 5 military commanders, and we have Level 5 sports coaches, and Level 5 people who run homeless centers, and people who run unsung parts of businesses. Our problem is not an absence of Level 5 in our society. Our problem is an absence of the wisdom to put them in the positions of responsibility and power. There's so much opportunity, untapped opportunity, if we just take those Level 5s and we give them the keys to the car. Level 5 leadership, key points. At the end of every chapter, I'm going to do a quick summary, of bullet points, if you will, of some of the key wrap-up findings from our research in that chapter. I'll do this at the end of every chapter to give you a reminder set of reinforcing ideas to carry into the next chapter. Every Good to Great leader had Level 5 leadership during the pivotal transition years. Level 5 refers to a 5-level hierarchy of executive capabilities with Level 5 at the top. Level 5 leaders embody a paradoxical mix of personal humility and professional will. And never forget the definition of a Level 5. A Level 5 leader is one who is ambitious first and foremost for the cause, for the company, for the work, not himself or herself, and has the will to make good on it. Level 5 leaders set up their successors for even greater success in the next generation, whereas egocentric Level 4 leaders often set their successors for failure. Level 5 leaders display a compelling modesty. They are often self-effacing and understated. In contrast, 2/3 of the comparison companies had leaders with gargantuan personal egos that contributed to the demise or continued mediocrity of the company. Let me be clear about one point, though. We don't want to say that a Level 5 leader cannot be charismatic. There have been charismatic Level 5 leaders. Sam Walton of Walmart was a charismatic Level 5 leader. He was able to build a company that would ultimately transcend him, would go beyond his personal charisma. So I don't want you to get hung up on the idea here that if you have charisma, you can't be Level 5, or that if your leading executive has charisma, that individual cannot be Level 5. The critical question is not personality, not charisma, but rather ambition. Are you ambition for the cause, or are you ambition for yourself? Level 5 leaders are fanatically driven, infected with an incurable need to produce sustained results. They are resolved to do whatever it takes to make the company great, no matter how big or hard the decisions. They display a workmanlike diligence, more plow horse than show horse. They look out the window to attribute success to factors other than themselves. When things go poorly, however, they look in the mirror and blame themselves, taking full responsibility. The comparison chief executives often did just the opposite, looking in the mirror to take credit for success, but pointing out the window to assign blame for disappointing results. A question for you right now, wherever you're listening to this: what is your relationship to the window and the mirror? Do you point out the window to give others credit, or do you point out the window to blame other factors when things go badly? What is your relationship to the window and the mirror? One of the most damaging trends in recent history is the tendency, especially by boards of directors, to select dazzling celebrity leaders and to deselect potential level 5 leaders. There were also a few unexpected findings. Larger-than-life celebrity leaders who write in from the outside turn out to be negatively correlated with going from good to great. 10 of 11 of the good to great CEOs came from inside the company, whereas the comparison companies tried outside CEOs 6 times more often, and they failed to become great. Level 5 leaders attribute much of their success to good luck rather than to personal greatness. And most important, we were not looking for level 5 leadership in our research, but the data was overwhelming and convincing. We were surprised by the finding. Keep in mind, I had set out at the beginning of the study to not even have a leadership answer of any type, and yet the data was overwhelming. The data led us to the conclusion. The data spoke. Chapter 3. First who, then what? There are going to be times when we can't wait for somebody. Now either you're on the bus or off the bus. Ken Kesey, from the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe. When we began the research project, we expected to find that the first step in taking a company from good to great would be to set a new direction, a new vision and strategy for the company, and then to get people committed and aligned behind that new direction. We found something quite the opposite. The executives who ignited the transformations from good to great did not first figure out where to drive the bus and then get people to take it there. No, they first got the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and then they figured out where to drive it. They said, in essence, look, I don't really know where we should take this bus, but I know this much. If we get the right people on the bus, the right people on the right seats, and the wrong people off the bus, then we'll figure out how to take it someplace great. The good to great leaders understood 3 simple truths. First, if you begin with who rather than what, you can more easily adapt to a changing world. If people join the bus primarily because of where it's going, well, what happens if you get 10 miles down the road and you need to change direction? You've got a problem. But if people are on the bus because of who else is on the bus, then it's much easier to change direction. Hey, I got on this bus because of who else is on this bus. If we need to change direction to be more successful, that's fine with me. Second, if you have the right people on the bus, the problem of how to motivate and manage people largely goes away. The right people don't need to be tightly managed, or fired up, or motivated, or disciplined. They will be self-motivated, self-inspired, self-disciplined, self-guided. They'll be motivated by the inner drive to produce the best results and to be part of creating something great. Third, if you have the wrong people, it doesn't really matter whether you discover the right direction. You still won't have a great company. great vision without great people is irrelevant. Consider the case of Wells Fargo during its transition in the 1970s and 80s. Wells Fargo began its 15-year stint of spectacular performance in 1983. But the foundation for that shift dates back to the early 1970s, when then CEO Dick Cooley began building one of the best, most talented management teams in the industry. The best team, according to investor Warren Buffett. Cooley foresaw that the banking industry would eventually undergo wrenching change, but he didn't pretend to know what form that change would take. So instead of mapping out a strategy for change, he and Chairman Ernie Arbuckle focused on injecting an endless stream of talent directly into the veins of the company. They hired outstanding people whenever and wherever they might find them, often without any specific job. That's how you build the future, said Cooley. If I'm not smart enough to see the changes that are coming, they will. And they'll be flexible enough to deal with them. Cooley's approach proved prescient. No one could predict all the changes that would be wrought by banking deregulation. Yet, when these changes came, no bank handled those challenges better than Wells Fargo. At a time when its sector in the banking industry fell 59% behind the general stock market, Wells Fargo outperformed the market by over 3 times. Carl Reichert, who became CEO in 1983, attributed the bank's success largely to the people around him, most of whom he inherited from Cooley. As he listed members of the Wells Fargo executive team that had joined the company during the Cooley-Reichert era, we were stunned. Nearly every person had gone on to become CEO of a major company. Bill Aldinger became the CEO of Household Finance. Jack Grundhofer became CEO of U.S. Bancorp. Frank Newman became CEO of Bankers Trust. Richard Rosenberg became CEO of Bank of America. Bob Joss became CEO of Westpac Banking, one of the largest banks in Australia, and later became Dean of the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Not exactly your garden variety executive team. R.J. Miller, an active Wells Fargo board member for 17 years, told us that the Wells Fargo team reminded him of the famed Whiz Kids, recruited to Ford Motor Company in the late 1940s, of which, in fact, Miller was a member, eventually becoming president himself of Ford. Wells Fargo's approach was simple. You get the best people, you build them into the best managers in the industry, and you accept the fact that some of them will be recruited to become CEOs of other companies. Bank of America, the comparison company to Wells Fargo during the 1980 transition period, took a very different approach. While Dick Cooley systematically recruited the best people he could get his hands on, Bank of America, according to the book Breaking the Bank, followed something called the weak generals, strong lieutenants model. It works like this. If you pick strong generals for key positions, their competitors will leave. But if you pick weak generals, placeholders rather than highly capable executives, then the strong lieutenants are more likely to stick around. The weak generals model produced a climate very different at Bank of America than the one at Wells Fargo. Whereas the Wells Fargo crew acted as a strong team of equal partners, ferociously debating eyeball to eyeball in search of the best answers, the Bank of America weak generals would wait for directions from above. Sam Armacost, who inherited the weak generals model, described the management climate. I came away quite distressed from my first couple of management meetings. Not only couldn't I get conflict, I couldn't even get comment. They were all waiting to see which way the wind blew. A retired Bank of America executive described senior managers in the 1970s as plastic people who had been trained to quietly submit to the diktats of a domineering CEO. Later, after losing over $1 billion in the mid-1980s, Bank of America recruited a gang of strong generals to turn the bank around. And where did it find those strong generals? From right across the street at Wells Fargo. In fact, Bank of America recruited so many Wells Fargo executives during its turnaround that people inside began to refer to themselves as Wells of America. At that point, Bank of America began to climb upward again, but it was too little, too late. From 1973 to 1998, while Wells Fargo went from build-up to breakthrough results, Bank of America's cumulative stock returns didn't even keep pace with the general market. You might be thinking, that's just good management. The idea of getting the right people around you. What is so new about that? On one level, we have to agree. It's just plain old-fashioned good management. But what stands out with such distinction in the good to great companies are two key points that made them quite different. To be clear, the main point of this chapter is not just about assembling the right team. That's nothing new. The main point is to first, above all else, before everything else, get the right people on the bus, the right people in the right seats, and the wrong people off the bus before you figure out where to drive it. First, the right people, then where to drive it. Not figure out where to drive it, then get the right people. The second key point is the degree of sheer rigor needed in people decisions in order to take a company from good to great. First who is a very simple idea to grasp and a very difficult idea to do. And most don't do it well. It's easy to talk about paying attention to people decisions, but how many executives have the discipline of David Maxwell, who held off on developing a strategy until he got the right people in place, while the company was losing $1 million every single business day with $56 billion of loans underwater? Would you have the discipline to wait to set your strategy until you had the right people in place if you were losing $1 million a day with $56 billion of mortgage loans underwater? That's the kind of discipline First Who requires. When Maxwell became CEO of Fannie Mae during its darkest days, the board desperately wanted to know how he was going to rescue the company. This was the early 1980s. Despite the immense pressure to act, to do something dramatic, to seize the wheel and start driving, Maxwell focused first on getting the right people on the management team. His first act was to interview all the officers. He sat them down and said, "Look, this is going to be a very hard challenge. I want you to think about how demanding this is going to be. If you don't think you're going to like it, that's fine. Nobody's going to hate you." Maxwell made it absolutely clear there would only be seats for A players who were going to put forth an A-plus effort. And if you weren't up for it, you'd better get off the bus, and get off now. One executive who had just uprooted his life and career to join the team came to Maxwell and said, "I listened to you very carefully, and I don't want to do this." He left and went back to where he came from. In all, 14 of 26 executives left the company, replaced by some of the best, smartest, and hardest working executives in the entire world of finance. The same standard applied up and down the Fannie Mae ranks as managers at every level increased the caliber of their teams and put immense peer pressure upon each other, creating high turnover at first when some people just didn't pan out. "We had a saying, 'You can't fake it' at Fannie Mae," said one executive team member. "Either you knew your stuff or you didn't, and if you didn't, you'd just blow out of here." Wells Fargo and Fannie Mae both illustrate the idea that who questions come before what questions, before vision, before strategy, before tactics, before organizational structure, before technology. Dick Cooley and David Maxwell both exemplified a classic level 5 style when they said, "I don't know where we should take this company, but I do know that if I start with the right people, ask them the right questions, and engage them in vigorous debate, we will find a way to make this company great." In contrast to the good to great companies, which built deep and strong executive teams, many of the comparison companies followed what I like to call a genius with 1,000 helpers model. In this model, the company is a platform for the talents of an extraordinary individual. In these cases, the towering genius, the primary driving force of the company's success, is a great asset, so long as the genius sticks around. The geniuses seldom build great management teams for the simple reason that they don't need one, and often don't want one. If you're a genius, you don't need to build a Wells Fargo caliber management team of people who could run their own shows elsewhere. No, you just need an army of good soldiers who can help you implement your great ideas. However, when the genius leaves, if you were to leave, if you're a genius, the helpers are often lost. Or worse, they try to mimic their predecessor with bold, visionary moves, trying to act like a genius without actually being a genius. And that proves unsuccessful. Eckerd Corporation suffered the liability of a leader who had an uncanny genius for figuring out what to do, but little ability to assemble the right who on the executive team. Jack Eckerd, blessed with the monumental personal energy. He in fact campaigned for governor of Florida while running his company. He had a genetic gift for market insight and shrewd deal-making, acquired his way from 2 little stores in Wilmington, Delaware, to a drugstore empire of over 1,000 stores spread across the southeastern United States. By the late 1970s, Eckerd's revenues equaled Walgreens. And at that time, it looked like Eckerd might triumph as the great company in the industry. But then Jack Eckerd left to pursue his passion for politics, running for senator and joining the Ford administration. Without his guiding genius, Eckerd's company began a long decline, eventually being acquired by J.C. Penney. The contrast between Jack Eckerd and Cork Walgreen is striking. Whereas Jack Eckerd had a genius for picking the right stores to buy, Cork Walgreen, well, he had a genius for picking the right people to hire. Whereas Jack Eckerd had a gift for seeing which stores should go in what locations, Cork Walgreen had a gift for seeing which people should go in what seats. Whereas Jack Eckerd failed utterly at the single most important decision facing any executive, and that is the selection of a successor, Cork Walgreen developed multiple outstanding candidates and selected a superstar successor who may in fact prove in the end to have been better than Cork himself. Whereas Jack Eckerd had no executive team, but instead a bunch of capable helpers assembled to assist the great genius, Cork Walgreen built the best executive team in the industry. Whereas the primary guidance mechanism for Eckerd's corporation strategy lay inside Jack Eckerd's head, the primary guidance mechanism for Walgreens' corporate strategy lay in the group dialogue and shared insights of a very talented executive team. This genius with 1,000 helpers model is particularly prevalent in the unsustained comparison companies. Now keep in mind, these are the companies that showed a shift from good results to great results, but then lost it fairly quickly. They went from good to great and then crashed back down again. The most classic case comes from a man known as the Sphinx, Henry Singleton of Teledyne. Singleton grew up on a Texas ranch with a childhood dream of becoming a great businessman and the model of the rugged individualist. Armed with a PhD from MIT, he founded Teledyne. The name Teledyne derives from Greek and means force applied at a distance. Turns out to be an apt name. as the central force holding the far-flung empire together was Henry Singleton himself. Through acquisition, Singleton built the company from a small enterprise to number 293 on the Fortune 500 list in 6 years. 0 to Fortune 500 in 6 years. Within 10 years, he'd completed more than 100 acquisitions, eventually creating a far-flung enterprise with 130 profit centers in everything from exotic metals to insurance. Amazingly, the whole system worked, with Singleton himself acting as the glue that connected all the moving parts together. At one point, he said, or was quoted in an article as saying, "I define my job as having the freedom to do what seems to me to be in the best interest in the company at any time." A 1978 Forbes feature story maintained, quote, "Singleton will win no awards for humility, but who can avoid standing in awe of his impressive record?" Unquote. Singleton continued to run the company well into his 70s, with no serious thought given to succession. After all, why worry about succession when the very point of the entire thing is to serve as a platform to leverage the talents of your remarkable genius? That's the purpose of the company. If there is a single weakness in this otherwise brilliant picture, the article continued, it is this. Teledyne is not so much a system as it is the reflection of one man's singular discipline. What a weakness it turned out to be. Once Singleton stepped away from day-to-day management in the mid-1980s, the far-flung empire began to crumble. From the end of 1986 until its merger with Allegheny in 1995, Teledyne's cumulative stock returns imploded, falling 66% behind the general stock market. Singleton, the genius, the towering individual, the genius with 1,000 helpers, Singleton achieved his childhood dream of becoming a great businessman in the image of the rugged individualist, the Sphinx. But he failed. He failed utterly at the task of building a great company. It's who you pay, not how you pay them. We expected to find that changes in incentive systems, especially executive incentives, would be highly correlated with making the leap from good to great. With all the attention paid to executive compensation, with the shift to stock options and the huge packages that have become commonplace, surely, has to be true. We thought the amount and structure of compensation must play a key role in going from good to great. How else do you get people to do the right things to create great results? How else could we possibly explain these large amounts of executive compensation? We were dead wrong in our expectations. We found no systematic pattern linking executive compensation to the process of going from good to great. The evidence simply does not support the idea that the specific structure of executive compensation acts as a key lever in taking a company from good to great. Scott Jones and Amber Young on my team did a heroic job spending weeks inputting compensation data from proxy statements and performed 112 separate quantitative analyses, looking for patterns and correlations, trying to find the link between executive compensation amounts or structures or patterns and results. We examined everything we could quantify for the top 5 officers: cash versus stock, long-term versus short-term incentives, salary versus bonus, and so forth. Some companies used stock extensively. Others didn't. Some had high salaries. Others didn't. Some made significant use of bonus incentives. Others didn't. Most important, when we analyzed executive compensation patterns relative to the comparison companies, we found no systematic differences on the use of stock or not, high salaries or not, bonus incentives or not, or long-term compensation or not. In short, it doesn't really seem to matter how you compensate your executives. The only significant difference we found was that the good to great executives received slightly less, yes, less, total cash compensation 10 years after the transition than their counterparts at the still mediocre comparison companies. That's right, the ones who produced the best results on a cash basis came away with less. Not that executive compensation is irrelevant. You have to be basically rational and reasonable. I doubt that Coleman Mockler, David Maxwell, or Darwin Smith would have worked for free. And the good to great companies did spend time thinking about the issue. But once you've structured something that makes basic sense, executive compensation falls away as a distinguishing variable in moving an organization from good to great. Why might that be? Why might there be no significant correlation between executive compensation and great long-term shareholder returns? Well, think about it this way. It's a manifestation of the first who principle. It's not how you compensate your executives. The key variable is which executives you have to compensate in the first place. First who have the right executives, then what? Figure out how to compensate them. If you have the right executives on the bus, they will do everything within their power to build a great company, not because of what they're going to get for it, but because they simply cannot imagine settling for anything less. Their moral code, their inner DNA, their core values require building excellence for its own sake. And you're no more likely to change that with a compensation package than you're likely to affect whether they breathe. The good to great companies understood a simple truth. The right people will do the right things and deliver the best results they're capable of, regardless of the incentive system. Wherever you are, take in this point. Yes, compensation and incentives are important, but for very different reasons in good to great companies. The purpose of a compensation system should not be to get the right behaviors from the wrong people, but to get the right people on the bus in the first place and to keep them there. In short, there is no such thing as an incentive system. There is no such thing as a motivational compensation system. There is instead attraction and retention systems, and compensation is about attracting and retaining the right people who are self-motivated and self-disciplined and who will produce results because it's who they are. First who, then what? We were not able to look as rigorously at non-executive compensation. Such data is not available in as systematic a format as proxy reports for top officers, which we had for the above analysis. Nonetheless, evidence from source documents and articles suggests that the same idea applies at all levels of an organization. A particularly vivid example, and in fact one of my favorites, is Nucor. Nucor built its entire system on the idea that you can teach farmers how to make steel, but you can't teach a farmer work ethic to people who don't have it in the first place. So instead of setting up mills in traditional steel towns like Pittsburgh and Gary, Nucor located its plants in places like Crawfordsville, Indiana, Norfolk, Nebraska, and Plymouth, Utah. Places full of real farmers who go to bed early, rise at dawn, and get right to work without fanfare. Gotta milk the cows and gonna plow the North 40 before noon. Translated easily into gotta roll some sheet steel and gonna cast 40 tons before lunch. Nucor ejected people who did not share this work ethic. generating as high as 50% turnover in the first year of a plant. 50%. 1 and 2 don't make it. Followed by very low turnover as the right people settled in for the long haul. To attract and keep the best workers, Nucor paid its steel workers more than any other steel company in the world. But it built its pay system around a high-pressure team bonus mechanism, with over 50% of a worker's compensation tied directly to the productivity of his or her work team of 20 to 40 people. Nucor team members would usually show up for work 30 minutes early to arrange their tools and prepare to blast off the starting line the instant the shift gun fired. Quote, "We have the hardest working steel workers in the world," said one Nucor executive. And this is one of my favorite quotes in the whole book. "We hire 5, we work them like 10, and pay them like 8. Here's the key. The Nucor system did not aim to turn lazy people into hard workers. It didn't try to do that, but rather to create an environment where hard-working people who can't help themselves, they have to work hard because it's who they are. These people would thrive, and lazy workers would either jump or get thrown right off the bus. In one extreme case, workers chased a lazy teammate right out of the plant with an angle iron. Nucor rejected that old adage that people are your most important asset. In a good to great transformation, people are not your most important asset. The right people are. Nucor illustrates a key point. In determining the right people, the good to great companies placed greater weight on character attributes than on specific educational background, practical skills, specialized knowledge, or work experience. Not that specific knowledge or skills are unimportant, but they viewed these traits as more teachable, or at least learnable. Whereas they believed dimensions like character, work ethic, intelligence, dedication to fulfilling commitments, and values are more ingrained. As Dave Nassif of Pitney Bowes put it, "I used to be in the Marines, and the Marines got a lot of credit for building people's values. But that's not the way it really works. The Marine Corps recruits people who share the Corps' values, then provides them with the training required to accomplish the organization's mission." We look at it the same way at Pitney Bowes. We have more people who want to do the right thing than most companies. We don't just look at experience. We want to know, who are they? Why are they? We find out who they are by asking them why they made decisions in their life. The answers to these questions give us insight into their core values. One good to great executive said that his best hiring decisions often came from people with no industry or business experience. In one case, he hired a manager who'd been captured twice during the Second World War and escaped both times. "I thought anyone who could do that shouldn't have trouble with business," he said. Rigorous, not ruthless. The good to great companies probably sound like tough places to work. And at their best, they are. If you don't have what it takes, you probably won't last long. But they're not ruthless cultures, they're rigorous cultures. And the distinction is crucial. To be ruthless means hacking and cutting, especially in difficult times, or wantonly firing people without any thoughtful consideration. To be rigorous means consistently applying exacting standards at all times and at all levels, especially in upper management. To be rigorous, not ruthless, means that the best people need not worry about their positions and can concentrate fully on their work. In 1986, Wells Fargo acquired Crocker Bank and planned to shed gobs of excess cost in the consolidation. There's nothing unusual about that. Every bank merger in the era of deregulation aimed to cut excess cost out of a bloated and previously protected industry. However, what was unusual about the Wells-Crocker consolidation is the way Wells integrated management, or to be more accurate, the way it didn't even try to integrate most Crocker management into the Wells culture. The Wells Fargo team concluded right up front that the vast majority of Crocker managers would be the wrong people on the bus. Crocker people had long been steeped in the traditions and perks of old-style banker culture, complete with a marbled executive dining room with its own chef and $500,000 worth of china. Quite a contrast to the Spartan culture at Wells Fargo, where management ate food prepared by a college dormitory food service. Wells Fargo made it clear to the Crocker managers, look, this is not a merger of equals. It's an acquisition. We bought your branches and your customers. We didn't acquire you. Wells Fargo terminated most of the Crocker management team. 1,600 Crocker managers gone on day one. 1,600 gone on day one, including nearly all the top executives. A critic might say, and you might even be thinking, that was just the Wells people protecting their own. But consider the following fact. Wells Fargo also sent some of its own managers packing in cases where the Crocker managers were judged as better qualified. When it came to management, the Wells Fargo standards were ferocious and consistent. Like a professional sports team, only the best made the annual cut, regardless of position or tenure. Summed up one Wells Fargo executive, quote, "The only way to deliver to the people who are achieving is to not burden them with the people who are not achieving," unquote. You might be thinking, boy, that sounds awfully ruthless. On the surface, it looks ruthless. But the evidence suggests that the average Crocker manager was just not the same caliber as the average Wells Fargo manager, and would have failed in the Wells Fargo performance culture. If they weren't going to make it on the bus in the long term, why let them suffer in the short term? One senior Wells Fargo executive told us, "We all agreed this was an acquisition, not a merger, and there's no sense beating around the bush, not being straightforward with people. We decided it would be best to simply do it on day one. We planned our efforts so that we could say right up front, sorry, we don't see a role for you," or, "Yes, we do see a role. You have a job, so stop worrying about it." We were not going to subject our culture to a death by 1,000 cuts. You want to talk about ruthless? To let people languish in uncertainty for months or years, stealing precious time in their lives that they could use to move on to something else, when in the end, they're not going to make it anyway. That would be ruthless. To deal with it right up front, to be honest, to be forthright, to be consistent, and to let people get on with their lives, that is rigorous. Not that the Crocker acquisition is easy to swallow. It's never pleasant to see thousands of people lose their jobs. But the era of bank deregulation saw hundreds of thousands of lost jobs. Given that, it's interesting to note 2 points. First, Wells Fargo did fewer big layoffs than its comparison company, Bank of America. This is the power of comparisons. Wells Fargo looks rigorous and ruthless for cutting all of these people out, but then you look at the comparison and find they did it even more. Second, upper management, including some senior Wells Fargo upper management, suffered more on a percentage basis than lower-level workers in the consolidation. Rigorous not ruthless, in a good to great company applies first at the top, focused on those who hold the largest burden of responsibility. To be rigorous in people decisions means first becoming rigorous about top management people decisions. I remember writing Good to Great, and I feared that people might use first who rigor as an excuse for mindlessly chopping out people to improve performance. I still worry about that. It's hard to do, but we've got to be rigorous. I read it in Good to Great. I can hear people say this, and I cringe. For not only will a lot of hard-working people get hurt in the process, but the evidence suggests that such tactics are contrary to producing sustained great results. The Good to Great companies rarely used headcount lopping as a tactic, and almost never used it as a primary strategy. Even in the Wells Fargo case, the most extreme in our study, the company used layoffs half as much as its comparison company Bank of America during the transition era. We went back and analyzed the role of layoffs in restructuring. Here's what we found. 6 of the 11 Good to Great companies recorded 0 layoffs from 10 years before the breakthrough date all the way through 1998. And 4 others reported only 1 or 2 layoffs. Let me just stop and think about that for a moment. These were companies that had to change their performance. These were companies that had terrible to, at best, good performance. And 6 of 11 of them recorded 0 layoffs from 10 years before their breakthrough all the way up through 1998. And only 1 or 2 layoffs in 4 of the others. Now let's look at the comparisons, where in contrast, we found layoffs used 5 times more frequently than in the Good to Great companies. Some of the comparison companies had an almost chronic addiction to layoffs and restructurings. It would be a mistake, a tragic mistake, to think that the way you ignite a transformation from good to great is by wantonly swinging the axe on vast numbers of hardworking people. Endless restructuring and mindless hacking were never, and are not today, part of any good to great model. Rigorous, not ruthless.